All right, so picture this, the Sahara Desert, right? Today, it's like the ultimate symbol of dryness.
Yeah.
But get this, it was once a lush green savanna. Like, seriously, can you even wrap your head around that?
It's a pretty wild thought, isn't it?
And this wasn't some quick blip on the radar. This was the African Humid Period. It lasted for millennia,
Right.
from about 14,500 to 5,000 years ago. And then, boom, the rains just stopped. And the
Yeah.
whole thing started transforming back into this desert. So today, we're going to dive deep into this crazy environmental shift
Okay.
and see what it tells us about a huge but kind of a forgotten chapter of human history in North Africa.
So for those of you listening who I know love to just efficiently grab those big historical takeaways,
Yeah.
this is going to be a great deep dive. We're going way beyond just the ancient landscape.
Right.
We're actually getting a genetic glimpse into a human lineage that thrived in this green world
Exactly.
and then had to deal with this huge reshaping of their world as the climate changed.
Yeah, and the key to unlocking this lost world is some really cool research. It's the first study to analyze ancient genomes from this green Sahara period.
Wow.
We're talking DNA from two individuals who lived 7,000 years ago.
Wow.
They were found in the Takarkori rock shelter in southwestern Libya. And get this, they were naturally mummified. That's why their DNA is still around for us to study.
You know, finding well-preserved genetic material in those kinds of super dry conditions is incredibly rare.
Oh, yeah.
So this study is really a unique chance to understand people from this specific time and place where we've had almost zero genetic evidence.
Totally. So our mission today is to figure out what these ancient genomes can tell us about North Africa's human story.
Okay.
We want to know how these people were connected to other ancient groups and how practices like herding, pastoralism,
Right.
spread across what was once this fertile region.
So let's start with a basic question. Who are these people found at Takarkori? And what makes their genetic info so important for understanding this whole period?
Well, the Takarkori rock shelter in southwestern Libya is like this super important archaeological site.
Okay.
Imagine it as this protected archive that gives us snapshots of life during the Green Sahara.
Okay.
And there's evidence of people living there as far back as 10,200 years ago. They were hunter-gatherer fishers.
Right.
And then later on, from about 8,300 to 4,200 years ago, things shifted and herding became like the main way of life. That's the pastoral Neolithic period.
And inside this rock shelter, archaeologists found 15 human burials. Most of them date back to the early and middle pastoral periods.
Okay.
And these periods are super interesting because they show us those early stages of how herding was adopted and developed in this part of Africa.
Exactly. And this new study zeroes in on two of those individuals, two adult women from the middle pastoral period.
Right.
Remember, they were naturally mummified, which is why we have their ancient DNA.
Right.
Based on radiocarbon dating, one of them lived roughly between 7,158 and 6,796 years ago,
Okay.
and the other one between about 6,555 and 6,281 years ago. So we're literally looking at the genes of people who lived smack dab in the middle of the Green Sahara era.
And analyzing their genetic material has uncovered something pretty big. Most of their ancestry goes back to a North African lineage that scientists hadn't really identified before.
Whoa!
And this isn't just some tiny offshoot. This represents a major branch in the human family tree,
Oh, wow.
a branch we basically knew nothing about.
This is where it gets really interesting. This whole lineage, this North African branch, split off from sub-Saharan African populations around the same time that modern humans started spreading out of Africa. That's like 50,000 years ago.
Right.
We're talking about a split happening at a super fundamental point in our species' history.
That's a really early split within Africa itself.
Yeah.
It suggests a picture of early human migration within the continent that's way more complex than we maybe thought.
Exactly. And what's even more fascinating is that this North African lineage seems to have stayed pretty isolated for a long time.
Right.
This points to a deep genetic continuity in North Africa during the late Ice Age.
Yeah.
These weren't just groups passing through. Their roots in this region go back thousands of years. It's like we've stumbled upon this hidden chapter in human history.
It is.
And even though this specific lineage might not exist in its pure form today,
Right.
the study says its genetic legacy is a big part of modern North African populations. So it's not like they completely disappeared. Their ancestry lives on in the people there today.
So how does this Takarkori lineage fit in with other ancient populations we found in North Africa?
Well, the study found some close genetic links between these individuals and 15,000-year-old foragers from Tafralt Cave in Morocco.
Wow, okay.
Now, these Tafralt folks lived way before the African Humid Period,
Right.
and they're connected to something called the Ibero-Mauritanian lithic industry. Basically, it's the specific style of stone tools they used. So we're seeing a connection across a huge span of time and totally different environmental conditions.
And what's super interesting is that both the Takarkori group from the Green Sahara and the earlier Tafaralt people show a similar level of genetic difference from sub-Saharan African lineages.
Okay, so what does that actually mean?
Well, it challenges the idea that the Green Sahara, with its more livable environment, led to a lot of genetic mixing between sub-Saharan and North African populations.
So even though it was greener, it was still like a barrier.
It's like even when it was greener, the Sahara still acted as a big genetic barrier.
Exactly. Some theories had suggested that the better conditions during the African Humid Period would have made it easier for genes to flow across the Sahara.
Yeah.
But this new genetic evidence points to this long-lasting pattern of relative isolation between those regions. Now, when we talk about ancient DNA, we always got to talk about Neanderthal ancestry.
Right.
What did the Takarkori genomes tell us about that?
That's a really interesting part of this whole thing. The Takarkori people did have some Neanderthal DNA,
Okay.
but it was about 10 times less than what's typical in people outside of Africa today.
So just a little...
However, it was still a bit higher than in modern sub-Saharan African populations.
More than some, less than others. So how do the researchers explain that?
Well, it shows that even though these early North Africans were mostly isolated, they weren't completely cut off.
Okay.
They probably got these tiny bits of Neanderthal DNA through contact with populations who'd already left Africa, and then some of them came back into North Africa bringing those genes with them.
So there was some connection, even if it wasn't like this huge mixing event.
Exactly.
Now, the big question, how did pastoralism, this whole herding lifestyle, spread across the Green Sahara? What did these genomes tell us about that?
Well, this is where the study really challenges some old ideas.
Okay.
Researchers only saw a little bit of genetic mixing between the Takarkori folks and groups from the Levant.
Interesting.
And that's important because the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean area, is usually seen as the place where pastoralism came from.
Right.
So if it wasn't a bunch of people migrating from the Levant with their herds, how did pastoralism get to North Africa?
Yeah, how did it spread?
The study suggests that it probably spread mostly through the exchange of ideas and cultural practices,
Oh.
what we call cultural diffusion.
Right.
So not big migrations, but more like sharing knowledge.
Got it.
The people already living in North Africa with their own unique genetics probably picked up herding from other groups who already knew how to do it.
That makes sense, especially when you look at the archaeological evidence.
Yeah.
It shows both continuity and changes in the tools and artifacts from around the time pastoralism appears.
Right.
It wasn't like one culture wiping out another. It was more like a gradual adoption of new ways of doing
Yeah.
things.
It's like a blending of cultures.
Right.
The archaeological evidence backs up the idea of cultural transmission more than a big influx of new people.
Now, this research also changes how we think about the ancestry of those Tafaralt hunter-gatherers, right?
Yes.
We talked about how genetically similar they are to the Takarkori group.
Right. Older models for the Tafaralt population said their ancestry was a mix of two main sources. The Tufians, ancient foragers from the Levant,
Right.
and another component that was broadly labeled as sub-Saharan African.
Okay.
But we weren't really sure where that sub-Saharan part came from.
So what's different now with this new study?
Now, we know that that sub-Saharan part in the Tafaralt ancestry is closely related to the lineage we see in the Takarkori individuals.
Okay.
In fact, the Takarkori lineage is a much better genetic match than any of the sub-Saharan groups we considered before.
So it clarifies things.
It's a big change in our understanding.
So what are the new proportions of their ancestry? How much is from where?
The updated model says about 60.8% of the Tafaralt ancestry comes from the Natufians, which is pretty close to what we thought before.
Okay.
But now we're saying the other 39.2% comes from a population that was similar to the Takarkori people.
And the study really emphasizes that both the Tafaralt and Takarkori groups have a similar level of genetic distance from sub-Saharan African lineages.
Yeah.
So even for these older groups, the Sahara seems to have been this big obstacle to genetic exchange.
Exactly. It shows that there wasn't much genetic interaction across the Sahara,
Yeah.
not just during the Green Sahara period when the Takarkori people were around,
Yeah.
but even earlier before it got wetter.
It's kind of counterintuitive, right? You'd think a greener Sahara would be easier to travel across,
Yeah.
which would lead to more mixing between populations. So why did this genetic isolation seem to stick around? Were there other things blocking them?
That's the question, isn't it? Researchers think there could be a few reasons.
Okay.
Even with more plants, the Sahara was still huge.
Right.
And it had all these different ecosystems, and maybe the livable areas were scattered,
Right.
which would have made it hard to travel far and interact with other groups.
It makes sense.
Plus, there could have been social and cultural differences that kept groups from mixing more widely.
So even though the Sahara got greener now and then, it wasn't enough to overcome these barriers that limited how much people were mixing genetically.
Right.
The Sahara, in a lot of ways, continued to shape how human populations were structured in Africa.
Exactly. It shows how much influence the Sahara had on the movement of genes.
Right.
And we can see that reflected both in this ancient DNA and in the genetic patterns we see in people living in the region today.
This is all so intricate and fascinating. Can you quickly explain the technical side of this? How did researchers actually get this ancient DNA and study it,
Sure.
especially considering how tough the conditions are in the Sahara?
So they used these cutting-edge techniques like whole genome sequencing,
Okay.
and they looked at specific genetic markers called SNPs. Think of those like unique spellings in our DNA code that help scientists trace ancestry.
Right.
It's pretty amazing that they were able to get usable DNA from 7,000-year-old remains in such a dry environment.
Yeah.
It really shows how far we've come in this field.
Yeah.
DNA preservation in the Sahara is super hard. It makes this study even more impressive.
Oh, yeah.
They had to use special methods to extract those tiny amounts of DNA that were left, and then they had to amplify it and analyze it using really sophisticated techniques.
So for everyone listening, let's sum up the key takeaways from our deep dive into these Green Sahara genomes.
Right.
What are the most important things to remember?
First, we found this long, isolated North African lineage,
Right.
a group of people who thrived for thousands of years
Yeah.
and whose genes are still part of the ancestry of North Africans today.
Okay.
Second, we saw evidence that there wasn't much genetic mixing across the Sahara,
Right.
even when the environment was much more livable.
Okay.
Third, we learned that herding probably spread through cultural practices,
Yeah.
more so than through big migrations from the Levant.
Right.
And finally, we now have a better understanding of the ancestry of earlier North African populations,
Right.
like those from Taforol.
Yeah.
And we see a strong genetic connection between them and this newly discovered North African lineage.
So why should all of us curious folks out there care about these findings? What's the big picture here?
Well, these findings are really important for understanding the broad patterns of human migration, adaptation, and cultural evolution in a really key part of Africa.
Right.
The Sahara has played this huge role in shaping human history,
Yeah.
and this ancient DNA evidence backs up a lot of what archaeologists have been saying.
Right.
It helps us build a more complete and nuanced picture of our past.
It shows how people can stay isolated even when the environment changes,
Yeah.
and how cultural innovations can spread without huge movements of people. It really gets you thinking, imagining this lost lineage thriving in a world that's now one of the most extreme environments on Earth.
Yeah.
Considering this deep genetic history and how dramatically the Sahara's climate has shifted,
Right?
what other secrets could be buried under those sands?
It's
It's waiting for us to discover them.
pretty incredible. This research reminds us that human populations are always changing,
Yeah.
and that changes in the environment have a huge impact on our history.
It makes you wonder what this long isolated lineage and how they adapted can tell us about our own future.
Right.
As we face a planet that's going through some major environmental changes itself.
It definitely gives us something to think about.
It really does. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See ya.